I'm talking to Chandran Nair, the author now of Dismantling Global White Privilege, Equity for a Post-Western World. And I must make the point that just as the book is not an attack on white people or the West as such, or it's much more than that, your aim is to unify, not to divide, because there are people that might think that the sort of discussion you're provoking is unhelpful.
That's absolutely right. And the response is, why are you dividing people? And I try to explain to them that it's actually a process of getting us to understand the great divides that exist, not to gloss over them and try to unite. But to unite, we need to have rather inconvenient conversations. But to unite, we need a narrative that enables us to calm down, to look at it. And to unite, we need people to judge what the injustices are, and with a proper narrative, essentially assemble in ways that we can find solutions. So it's just really providing that. And as you will know from the book, what I've tried to show is that many of the institutions of globalization perpetuate and preserve white privilege, and many of the rules of globalization essentially have white privilege woven into the rules, the fabric of globalization. And until we understand and unravel that, we will not be able to firstly address injustices, and only then can we look at essentially bringing people together.
Listeners to our conversation will be happy to admit that much of the White Australia policy bigotry lingers on. So if a country like ours can't eliminate racism and white privilege, how do you plan to get equity globally?
Well, equity globally is coming, partly because, as we are seeing, the dominance of the settler communities, Australia, etc., the US, etc., Canada, will wane with time. Thus, the angst about the rise of China. And quite often when my Indian friends listen to me, they say, my God, you're so pro-China. I said, I'm not pro-China at all in that sense. I'm just pro the rights of the others to rise. And when India gets its act together, the same coalition of Western powers will be against it. So what will happen, though, is the white nations of the world, if I can crudely call it that, will have to accept a new order. What I am trying to do with the book is get them to understand that equity is inevitable, and you should plan for that equity and be partners in building that rather than resisting it and thereby creating conflict. What the Western countries are doing with China is creating conflict because of an inability to accept the rights of others. And so this will come. But for the non-Western nations, this is a longer discussion, Philip, but my point is, and I mentioned this in my first book, is not to ape the Western economic model, which is essentially premised around extraction, exploitation, and the externalization of true cost. The entire economic model is broken, and we will have to do something different. Because if we follow the economic model, particularly of the Anglosphere, that has dominated the world for the last 100 years, well, 6 billion Asians will essentially destroy the world because we cannot consume like the average European, Australian, or American. So that's the other flip side to this discussion about equity.
Tell me about the IMF's history in this.
Well, the IMF's history in all of this, as you would know, it has its roots in the post-Second World War, Bretton Woods agreement, etc. And those who have a understanding of how the primacy of the dollar was created as the reserve currency for the world, part of the grand bargain. And the IMF is essentially, and the World Bank work together as essentially stewards of the global economy from the point of view of development, and as well as essentially having a global monetary system underpinned by the US dollar. But the problem with this continues to be that the dominance of the Western powers to dictate what happens, and the World Bank chief is always an American, and the IMF is a European, and that in itself disqualifies so many people from different parts of the world. But the underlying message to the rest of the world is, we're not good enough, and even if you're good enough, we can't trust you. And more importantly, we need to control how the decisions are made. And that is essentially, in my eyes, a race-based policy.
Chandran, we've riffled through only a few pages of your book, but I'd like to end with your great passion, and indeed mine, which is the environment.
Well, on the environment, I've been involved in the environmental discussions and policies around the world for about 30 years. And one of the things that has always struck me, particularly in the last 10 years, is that many of the policies, and we look at the existential threat of climate change, have been framed through the lens of the Western economic model and also the political system. And the problem has been, of course, that going back 20 years ago, many of the other developing countries didn't have essentially the policy instruments or even the knowledge, dare I say, or nor the political clout to influence how global agreements are being made. So the conversation, the narrative is dominated by Western commentators. I bet you'd find it very difficult to name leading spokesman on the environment from other parts of the world. Most Americans, Europeans, and Australians could not mention a single person from China who leads in the environmental front. But most people in the world know of a 17-year-old girl from Europe, as if there aren't younger people from Africa, China, India, who are strongly committed and, dare I say, even more knowledgeable.